This is the 12th talk in this quarterly series, end of year 4, Philosophers in the Midst of History, here at the Frank Weinberg. And this time we're talking about somebody who I'm very interested in and have been reading since I was quite young, and that's Albert Camus. I can't say I actually understood much of what I was reading back then. Hopefully I understand more now. And what we do in these talks is take important philosophers like, everybody from Plato all the way up to Hannah Arendt, and we talk about some of their thought and key ideas, but we locate them in relation to the historical situation that they were coming out of, and in some respects then had an influence on. So there's a back and forth. They're products of their history, but they also help to produce history. And with Camus, he was really deeply involved in the history of his time. He engaged in a lot of reflection on the wars that were happening. You notice that his life essentially begins with a war which he's too young to remember. He lives through the Second World War. He goes through the Cold War, dies before the Algerian War is actually brought to a successful resolution, and was taking a stand on that. He also was involved pretty heavily in leftist politics and you could say movements, but wasn't very happy with a lot of the leftists of his time, and we'll talk about that in a bit. And he was really, I would say, a lot of people think that, they hear the word Albert Camus and they think, myth of Sisyphus and the stranger, and they think of, an absurd world, and that is part of his work. But I think that really the central theme of his ideas and the thing that preoccupied him through his whole life is how to live ethically in an absurd world, in a world that doesn't have any intrinsic meaning and will, anytime you try to ascribe it some, is going to knock it down or disappoint you. And so we'll talk about how we get there. And I would actually say this book right here is probably the most important one, The Rebel, which he wrote later on. For thinking about those ideas. He developed in his thinking over time, too. He wasn't somebody who just came up with some ideas, stuck with them, ran them into the ground. He was continually working through these thoughts in relation to the world that he was seeing. So I think he's somebody who's particularly appropriate for this series. And If you're willing to indulge me, I'll tell you about how I first came to read Camus and encountered him. So I was in probably, I think, either middle school or high school, probably maybe the summer between that. And I had an uncle who read a lot of books. And he actually had our great uncle who also read a lot of books. So he might have gotten this book from him. And he was living in the basement of my grandparents' house where I would stay over the summer. And I was looking through the books that he had. And I saw this book, The Myth of Sisyphus. And I thought, well, that's cool, because I knew about Greek mythology. And so I said, can I borrow that book? And he said, yeah, I couldn't make heads or tails of it. Here, have it, right? So I took it. And, of course, there's very little about Sisyphus in it until you get to the very end of it. And it begins by saying there's one philosophical question, and that's of suicide. And I was like, well, that's kind of a strange thing to start with. And so you read through it, and at that age, there were a lot of themes in it that were very captivating for me, but I don't think I understood them very well, and there were a lot of things in there I didn't understand at all. And then it had these essays after that didn't seem to have anything to do with the first essay. They'd be about shoes and Iran or things like that. So I just kind of put it down for a while. And then I got to college, and I became a philosophy major sort of through chance. And the place that I went to college was very interested in existentialism. As a matter of fact, they were so behind the times that they thought that was cutting-edge philosophy. And so everybody had to read Sartre and Nietzsche and Kierkegaard, and people read Camus, but Camus was looked at kind of suspect. He wasn't a very good philosopher. He's a great novelist. Don't bother reading his philosophical works. And actually, I didn't back then. So that waited until then I got to graduate school, and I started reading his philosophical works, and I thought, well, this is actually quite good. I could actually do something with this. And I find in him, I don't share some of his basic assumptions, but there's a kind of tenor to his work that I find quite admirable. He's not willing to take easy solutions. He's willing to say when he thinks he's got something wrong. He's willing to say, I don't know about this or that. And he's really fundamentally about trying to find a place in this universe that he thinks is cold and unforgiving for things like love and human decency and solidarity with those who are suffering. And he doesn't think that there's any easy solutions to these. So I think he's really a great person for our own times. I gave you a timeline that has two sides to it. And I should mention, too, if you guys have any questions at any point, just go ahead and interrupt me, and we'll discuss things, and then I'll come back to where I was intending to go. I'm quite used to that. So if there's anything that jumps out at you. So I put it into two columns. There's what happens to Camus in his life, and then there's what's going on in primarily Europe, although some things in Asia and some things in America. So you notice that he really, he's growing up in the after effect of the First World War, which was a catastrophe across Europe. It was sort of the end of an era of optimism and this notion that human beings would work everything out. Civilization is just getting better and better, because you had these highly civilized countries gunning each other down and throwing their young men, for the most part, although there were also a lot of women civilians who suffered, into the trenches and just getting them mowed down and chewed up. And it ends with a bad resolution, Germany, things never get fully resolved there. The Weimar Republic is not set on a good footing. All these new republics that are created, or democracies created in Eastern Europe by carving up the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, or the Russian Empire, most of them don't survive. They don't have democratic institutions, and they wind up veering very far to the left or very far to the right. Russia itself, goes through all of these upheavals under the Bolsheviks. And so he's living through this time. And the France of his time, actually, he doesn't start out in France. He starts out in North Africa, because he's born there. And he's not, he is a French citizen, but he's not, a French person, you could say, right?
Is it Algeria?
Yeah, and his mother stayed there too. And a little bit of trivia going way forward. One reason why he was reluctant to make any really absolute statements about the Algerian War was he would say, "Listen, my mom's there. I don't want people killing her." And I think that was a perfectly reasonable thing to say. But so his father, dies in a battle during World War I, and he moves in with his grandparents. And he goes to school, and, sort of like, we look at some of these other figures like Sartre, goes to the great schools and all that, because he's from Paris. Camus is a provincial. He's an outsider, literally. Another translator of the stranger is the outsider, right? And he has a rough time as a kid. He gets tuberculosis, which affects your lungs. He plays soccer. He gets to go to school and he graduates. But the places that he's going to, they don't have the sort of resources that if Paris was the center of the French world, really, in a way that's hard for us to imagine here in America, and it still is. Everything that this is the way the Parisians think about it. Everything that matters happens in Paris. If you're going to study, you study in Paris. Why would you bother with any of this other stuff? And it can provoke a kind of sense of inferiority, you might say, which I don't think he suffered from, but he certainly was attuned to how things were for those who aren't in the elite. He's somebody who's growing up in the masses. And he ends up going to the University of Algiers when he's about 20 years old, gets married, gets this licence de philosophie, and then joins the French Communist Party, as you could kind of expect, somebody who's committed to benefiting the poor and ameliorating their condition. The French Communist Party was one of the few that was concerned with that sort of thing. He won't actually stay in the Communist Party that well because he has a hard time. He's the person sort of at the back of the room raising their hand saying, I think you guys are doing the right thing, but what about this other thing that you're doing? And then everyone tells him to shut up, the way that we often do things. So the communists did that sort of thing. And he starts working with theater. He founds this Théâtre du Travail, the workers' theater, you could say, the laborers' theater. The idea was you'd put on plays, and these would be serving, sort of two purposes. Well, three purposes, really. Entertainment would be one of them. There's a legitimate, I think, need on people's part for some sort of entertainment, right? And it would also be introducing the workers to culture, allowing them to have the benefit of what normally is just reserved for the elites, and it could work through the sort of plays that they would put on to help raise consciousness for them as well. And he does write his dissertation, which is on Christian thought and Neoplatonism. It does get published. I don't think it's translated at this point, and I don't think anybody's interested in translating it. I haven't read it. It might be quite good, but it might not be if it's like a lot of dissertations. Dissertations are your first work. A lot of people have these high expectations. This is a total digression. A lot of people have these high expectations for their dissertations. I encounter graduate students who are like, I'm going to write this wonderful piece. And I got this advice when I was working on my own dissertation that I totally ignored to my own detriment from one of my dissertation committee. He said, the only good dissertation is a done dissertation. Pick a simple topic, write about it, don't try to change the world, don't try to do anything, just get the hell out of here, and then write your good books later. Yeah, exactly. And it makes perfect sense, right? The first time that you do something, like you make a cake and you're going to put frosting on it, it's going to look like crap. So why would you expect it to be any different with your first book, right? And I never ended up publishing my dissertation because it was kind of a mess. And I tell young graduate students now the same sort of thing. Just pick something easy that you can get done, and then write your good stuff later on. And maybe Camus did that. Maybe he didn't. Certainly, he wrote a lot of good stuff later on. But he doesn't go for agrégation, which would allow him to teach because of a recurrence of his tuberculosis. And you notice what's happening during all this time. This is leading us up to about 36. So the Great Depression has happened. France, we don't often think of this, but France was one of the big powers at the time, and they were really pushing the Germans around. At the same time that the Nazi Party is rising, and you've got all this far-right activity and street battles between the Nazis and the communists and the Social Democrats sort of stuck in between. You also have a France that is lining up allies trying to ring Germany in and trying to crush Germany economically as much as they can. France invades Germany and takes over the Ruhr, which is their industrial center. So there's a lot of back and forth on both sides. And French politics were just a mess as well. Many times people, again, here's a bit of a digression. Today, people often want to liken America to the Roman Empire and say, we're at the end of our development. And there's a book by William Shire called The Fall of the French Third Republic. And when people start making all these Rome analogies or other analogies like that, I say, you want to understand where America is today? Read that book. Because what you had is a paralyzed political system that couldn't actually get anything done, with incredible ideological divides and rancor between the left and the right, and within the left and the right about what it meant to be on the left or on the right. And they were unable to see the threats that were coming and deal with them effectively. Because Hitler could have been snuffed out so easily. The entire Nazi apparatus. And as a matter of fact, when Hitler started engaging in his processes, of slowly swallowing up Austria and Czechoslovakia, he was terrified of the idea that the French might actually grow some backbone. This is the French generals that he's worried about, because the French generals were the ones who were saying, oh, no, we shouldn't do anything. The French politicians actually wanted to go and invade, and they were very worried that they might do that. They didn't, and the emboldened fascist regimes then marched all over and eventually started eyeing up Poland. But the French Republic that he's seeing is falling apart. It's dysfunctional. And he's also seeing it not only in terms of France and the rest of Europe, he's seeing it as a person in Algeria looking northward to the mother country and how things are working out in the relations between them. So he starts publishing things and starts writing. He joins the staff of a newspaper, and he writes his first play, Caligula, which would be put on much later on. And eventually he goes to France. And this is in 1940, a very propitious year for a lot of things, but also a very dismal year. That's the year that Germany invades and crushes France in the Blitzkrieg that goes across Holland and Belgium and France, destroys the French army. Hundreds of thousands of young Frenchmen are taken prisoner of war, including Jean-Paul Sartre, by the way, who writes some notebooks while he's in the prison camps. And France is divided into the Vichy regime in the south, run by Marshal Pétain, who's on the right and willing to cooperate with the Nazi regime, and the rest of France is occupied. And the Nazis begin to impose demands. In 1942, they conscript, first they call for volunteers. They only get 17,000 volunteers. But they wanted 250,000 young people to volunteer and work for the Nazis. When they don't get volunteers, they just start rounding them up. And then the next year they ask for another 250,000 young men and women to work. While this is going on, Camus is in Paris. He's already become divorced. He gets remarried. He goes to Paris, engages in some journalism, goes back to Algeria, and then in 1942 he returns to France, and he joins this resistance organization, Combat. Combat was the journal of the resistance, and it's bringing together all these different people who, if it wasn't for the fact that they hated the Nazi occupation, they probably wouldn't see eye to eye on a lot of things, and as a matter of fact, later on they wouldn't. And he ends up becoming the director of the journal, and then he publishes two works that I think probably are the ones he's best known for, right? The Stranger. Often they have people in their French classes reading that because it's such a simple story, and it's written at kind of a low level in terms of difficulty. And The Myth of Sisyphus, which I often mispronounce. I'm sure somebody will correct me on that. What's that?
It sounds right to me.
Yeah, it always does to me too, but people tell me that I get it wrong. And those are about an absurd world. And if you've read The Stranger, it's about this guy Meursault who ends up killing an Arab and then being executed for it, and doesn't have any explanation for why he did it. He's kind of a detached guy. And it's interesting because a lot of people think that he is, what Camus is advocating. And Camus says, this guy is a bastard. He's not at all what I'm all about. He's just one way that people live in an absurd world. It's not a model for how you ought to be. But a lot of people have taken that and that book, The Myth of Sisyphus, so you got a novel and you've got a philosophy book, as that's what Camus is all about. But in reality, that's just the beginning. He's writing many other things. And he's constantly working his thoughts out further. He meets Jean-Paul Sartre and becomes friends with him at a dress rehearsal of Les Mouches, or the Flies, which Sartre is putting on. And Combat moves. Camus publishes The Misunderstanding. His children are born. After the war is coming to a close, he finally gets to put his play on, Caligula, which I'm not a playwright, so I don't really have the kind of understanding of what it must be like to actually see a play that you've written being performed. I suppose it'd be like if you were writing a book and you see the book published, or you write a piece of music and somebody plays it. It must have been a very big moment. And you notice that there's years in between where that's not happening. The other thing that happens in 45 is he publishes these 4 letters called Letters to a German Friend. And they're very telling. They begin by, actually, I'll actually just pause and read you just a little bit of the first one. He says, "You said to me, the greatness of my country is beyond price. Anything is good that contributes to its greatness, and in a world where everything has lost its meaning, those who, like us young Germans, are lucky enough to find a meaning in the destiny of our nation must sacrifice everything else." So this is why a lot of people did embrace Nazism. They felt that the world was crap, and you've got to have something that'll give your life some direction to it. And he says to his friend, "I loved you then, but at that point we diverged. No, I told you, I cannot believe everything should be subordinated to a single end. There are means that cannot be excused. And I would love," this is a great line, "to be able to love my country and still love justice. I don't want just any greatness for it, particularly a greatness born of blood and falsehood. I want to keep it alive by keeping justice alive." And then his friend says, "Well, you don't love your country." And so the letters are going back and forth with this idea about, can you actually love the community that you belong to, but also subscribe to certain universal values that you would think as an existentialist or an absurdist he couldn't do, but he does. He thinks that justice really is important, and he thought that the Nazis lost sight of that, and he thought that the French were vacillating and all that, but when they finally did get into the fight, and they had right on their side, that made them more or less unstoppable. And we'll come back to that in just a bit, but I wanted to say a little bit about that. World War II ends, the United Nations gets founded, France gets a seat at the Security Council, they're back to being a big power again, and now Europe is divided between the Western Bloc and the Eastern Bloc, with the French kind of trying to sit out a lot of the time, and Spain and Portugal still under essentially militaristic, if not fascist regimes, the Franco and Salazar regime. And Camus, he continues to publish things. He writes a piece called Neither Victims Nor Executioners, and then he publishes The Plague, which I think a lot of other people have read. It's one of his best novels. It's a really beautiful piece. And then he publishes this State of Siege as well, and The Just Assassins. And by this time, now we're seeing the first Arab-Israeli war, and the intervention that is happening. The Berlin blockade starts. NATO is created. The People's Republic of China is created, and the Chinese nationalist government goes to Taiwan. And we're seeing a world that's more and more divided. The World War didn't actually settle anything, even after millions of casualties. Fascism lost, but now you've got communism, and you could call it a kind of Americanism, right? A liberal democracy, but very much driven by American interests and capitalism. And then some others trying to sort of sit it out. And then there's another thing that's happening at the time as well, which is decolonialization. France is involved by now in Indochina because the Vietnamese wanted them out, and they start losing pretty badly. And then, the British start losing bits of their empire as well, as do the Portuguese, and who else? I mean, the Spanish had bits and pieces of things. Camus continues working, and now he finds himself having difficulties because he is on the left. He thinks that the the left in general is the side that favors the common person, that is looking out for the ordinary person, the masses. But he's seeing what some of these regimes that are supposed to be devoted to that are doing, particularly the Soviet Union, which you remember invades Hungary and crushes the revolution there. He ends up splitting with Sartre, and that means not just splitting with Sartre, that means splitting with everybody who's friends with Sartre, like Simone de Beauvoir and a lot of other followers. And he's splitting essentially over how you should view communism. Then he publishes this, The Rebel, L'homme révolté, the man in, or the person in revolt. And this is really his best book of philosophy. Doesn't get read very much. Doesn't get talked about very much, unfortunately. But this is his mature work. It's not the end of what his work would have been, because he dies rather young, and somewhat tragically, but also, you could say, kind of comic tragically, right?
How did he die?
Driving a fast car,
Oh, yeah.
He was, this is another thing to say. So Camus was a guy who liked to live life hard, He enjoyed himself a lot. He got around in terms of sexual liaisons, and he certainly lived life as much as he could. But he thought you also had to respect certain ethical limits, and he was much more preoccupied with violence than anything else, I would say. But he was kind of he was a fast and loose liver, you could say. So it's not a surprise he died in a car crash, quite frankly. He does start protesting against Soviet repression, and he also gets involved in discussing the Algerian War. And the Algerian War was pretty horrific. After France retreats from Vietnam, decolonialization starts in earnest, because a lot of these other countries start realizing that, well, if you can kick them out of Vietnam, why not kick them out of here? And the FNL becomes the main, you could say, leader of the revolution in Algeria. There's other groups involved as well, and they're getting backing from different places, including Egypt under Nasser, which is part of why France actually gets involved in the Suez War. When there's a second Arab-Israeli war, and the French. I mean, I'm not going to say the French were the only people doing things wrong in Algeria. Both sides were, very early into the war committing horrible atrocities. And as a matter of fact, bombings were taking place in France, and not just of, say, Algerian liberationists against French people. It was also of different factions of the Algerian liberationists against each other in France. There was what was called the Café War, where lots of people died as well. So a lot of bloodshed, a lot of fighting, a lot of taking on other people as threats. And Camus' own group ends up turning on him, because he what he's advocating is sort of a cessation of violence. He thinks there should be a truce, and people should try to work things out. And saying that makes him unpopular with everybody. Unpopular with the French, unpopular with the Algerian liberationists, unpopular with the Pieds Noirs, the French Algerians who are fleeing from the countryside, whose farms had been by that time taken, but they'd gotten their farms because of confiscation of Algerian Muslims' farms at one time. So there's all this terrible tragedy going on around him. And he doesn't have an easy solution for things, but he can spell out what the problem is in ways that I think other people can't. He winds up getting the Nobel Prize for Literature, which is quite nice, because he's not going to live much longer than that. And like I mentioned, he doesn't actually see the end of the Algerian War. Charles de Gaulle, who, of course, had been a war hero for, declaring, the Free France and calling for enlistments to fight the Nazis immediately. Well, really, like days after Pétain starts his regime, he becomes president of the French Fifth Republic, because the Fourth Republic falls. And it's de Gaulle who actually is able to resolve Algeria, and he resolves it by leaving. The last thing I'll say about Algeria, too, just to sort of put it in perspective, you think about the things that happened in Vietnam under our occupation and war there. Many of them were tried out first in Algeria by the French, napalming people, for example. And napalm is pretty horrific, dumping napalm over areas. That was a French tactic that was used. PSYOPs, the French actually created a whole bunch of fake documents and got the people in the FNL to turn on each other, thinking that, different ones were moles or traitors, things like that. Both sides used torture pretty liberally. Both sides did atrocities against civilians. It was a pretty terrible situation, and Camus was reacting to that. So that is the history that he's engaged in. And so you could say on one side, so the history is conflict, war, deprivation, hostility, and then on the other side is, well, what leads people to that? Is it just economic motives or the drive for glory, or is it the fact that in the 20th century, a lot of people thought that life had kind of become meaningless, and they're looking for meaning in things that will lead them into these conflicts, that will produce violence as a way to deal with what he calls the absurd. So this is a good sort of lead-in, but I'm going to stop here for any questions that you have before I talk about existentialism and the absurd and get into the theory stuff. So if you have any questions or comments, we'll have time at the end for that too. But no? All right, well, let's talk then. First of all, Camus, I'm going to say, is an existentialist. He denied being an existentialist. So I've got to say why he should be considered one. Well, existentialism is a very broad family when you think about the history of philosophy, and not everybody who is in it called themselves an existentialist, and some of them actually repudiated the term. Camus isn't the only one. Gabriel Marcel, when he found out what Sartre meant by it, said, I'm not an existentialist anymore, I'm a philosopher of existence. Heidegger actually wrote a letter called the Letter on Humanism when Sartre was using the term and said, I'm not an existentialist anymore either. So that, whether they call themselves existentialists or not, that's not quite so important. Camus, when he talks about the existentialists, he means a certain segment of them. He means the people who like Sartre, and then he means these religious existentialists like certain Kierkegaard, Lev Shestov, who very few people read anymore, Martin Buber, the Jewish philosopher, and Gabriel Marcel. So when he's targeting the existentialists, those are the people that he means. But nowadays we place them all into this big map, and I created this handout for a different talk a while back, and I thought it would be quite useful for this. So you've got your first phase of existentialism, where people aren't actually quite realizing that it's a thing. Kierkegaard uses the term existential philosophy, but he doesn't call himself an existentialist. And then you got this guy Dostoevsky, who he's arguably a philosopher. He writes novels, but he's they're very philosophical. And then you got Friedrich Nietzsche, definitely a philosopher. And you could include Georg Brandes in there, the first person to start recommending Kierkegaard and Dostoevsky to Nietzsche. Ibsen, I think, could be in there. Tolstoy, Chekhov, August Strindberg. And you notice it's sort of primarily like a Northern European and Russian thing, right, at that time. Then we get the second phase, and some of these people are actually using the word existentialist here and drawing connections between them, like saying, hey, Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, those guys were actually up to the same thing, even though one is an anti-Christian and one is like a Christian who thinks most Christians aren't Christian enough. There's some common elements. So then you get like Shestov and Jaspers, and in Spain, Ortega y Gasset, Gabriel Marcel, another guy in Spain, Unamuno. You get some Russians, in there as well, Berjayev. Rilke, the poet, is in there, so is Kafka. Fondin, who unfortunately dies in the camps. He was one of the only students of Shestov. And then the third phase of existentialism, it like emerges out of the shadows, you could say, and becomes like a major going thing in philosophy. And you notice that quite a few of these people are French, or they write in French. You call this the French wave of existentialism, with a few exceptions, right? Ralph Ellison here in the United States, Frankl, writing in German. Who else? Boltmann, Biddenswanger. But for the most part, these are French writers. And Camus fits into there. And then we can talk about how, it became a big thing here in the States. And I would say the stuff in the States is mostly influenced by the French. And Camus would call what he was doing a philosophy of the absurd. And so a lot of people want to say he's an absurdist. But that can be a little misleading, because when we think of like absurdist playwrights, they're the ones who have just people doing random stuff. And Camus isn't about that. The Stranger could kind of give you that impression. But the other novels, that's not really the case. These are more like Dostoevsky, where the characters are, worrying about these moral dilemmas and arguing with each other. What should I do? This seems, like a lose-lose situation either way. How should I handle this? If you think about, some of his other works like The Fall or The Plague, that's really what's going on in there, right? Rather than, mother died today, or was it yesterday? I don't remember. I'm actually mangling the start of it, but it's not this sort of, insouciance, this not caring attitude. It's people who care too much in a lot of his works. And so I think he really is an existentialist. And if you have to say, well, what does it mean to be an existentialist? One of the key ideas is that the world, it may have a meaning. Some of the existentialists thought that it wasn't totally absurd, but we had to do a lot of the work to find that meaning. And most of our efforts to impose a meaning on the world were going to be unsuccessful. And Camus himself talks about the world as being absurd. And he actually clarifies in saying that the absurd is not just the world being screwed up and lacking meaning. It's about us in the world. He lays out this beautiful sort of triadic understanding of this in the myth of Sisyphus, where he says you have the human being, and the human being has, rationality and desires and wants the world, which doesn't actually share all those, to fit that somehow. We want the world to be the way we want it to be. We want it to make sense. We want things in the world to be rational. And Camus, points out over and over again, you look at this, you look at this, you look at this, you look at this. These are all places where things can like fall apart. And it could be as simple as like looking in the mirror and not recognizing yourself in the mirror, having that weird experience, or seeing other people and they look kind of mechanical, or thinking about what modern natural science is teaching us about the universe. It used to be we thought it was this nice law-bound regular sphere, and it turns out not quite so much, right? There's some weird things going on in different places, and then the scientists try to fix it up with their theories, and then the phenomena resist them again. Or think about affective things like falling in love. Well, that's a huge mess, right? And then being in a relationship, another huge mess. Things don't follow the way that we want them to. And he says that the divorce, he uses that word divorce, between the world and the person, that's what the absurd is. It's a third term that's not reducible just to the world and not just to the person. I think it's a great insight. And then the question is, okay, great, what then? And so in the myth of Sisyphus, he says the big philosophical problem, that's suicide. Should we kill ourselves? If the world doesn't have any meaning, then maybe we should just hang ourselves, or maybe. And then he discusses different ways that a person can do this. He thinks that religion is a way of killing your mind in a way, and he accuses some of the religious existentialists of a failure of nerve like that. In his later works, he's not going to stop there. So I gave you two passages that I think are really good for illustrating the difference between these. The first one is from The Stranger. And it's kind of long, but I'll read it anyway. He says, this is at the very end where this priest is trying to get him to confess. He says, you're going to feel so much better if you do, because then you'll go to your death, being right with God. And the character who's been kind of lackadaisical, just kind of going along with stuff this entire time, Merceau, he blows up at the priest. And he's here's what he says. I don't know how it was, but something seemed to break inside me, and I started yelling at the top of my voice. I hurled insults at him. I told him not to waste his rotten prayers on me. It was better to burn than to disappear. I'd taken him by the neckband of his cassock. In a sort of ecstasy of joy and rage, I poured out on him all the thoughts that had been simmering in my brain. He seemed so cocksure, you see, and none of his certainties were worth a strand of a woman's hair. Living as he did a corpse, he couldn't even be sure of being alive. It might look as if my hands were empty. Actually, I was sure of myself, sure about everything, far surer than he, sure of my present life and of the death that was coming. That, no doubt, was all I had. But at least that certainty was something I could get my teeth into, just as it had gotten its teeth into me. I'd been right. I was still right. I was always right. I'd passed my life in a certain way, and I might have passed it in a different way if I'd felt like it. I'd acted thus and hadn't acted otherwise. I hadn't done X, whereas I'd done Y or Z. Here's the key thing. And what did that mean? That all the time I'd been waiting for this present moment, for that dawn, tomorrow's or another's day, which was to justify me. Nothing had the least importance, and I knew well why. He too knew well why. It's a beautiful phrase. From the dark horizon of my future, a sort of slow, persistent breeze had been blowing towards me all my life long, from the years that were to come. And on that way, that breeze had leveled out all the ideas that people tried to foist, one in the equally unreal years that I then was living through. What difference could they make to me, the deaths of others, or of a mother's love, or his God, or the way a man decides to live, the fate he thinks he chooses, since one and the same fate was bound to choose not only me, but thousands of millions of privileged people like him who call themselves brothers. Surely he must see that. Every man alive was privileged. There was only one class of men, the privileged class. All alike would be condemned to die one day. His turn would come like the others. And what difference could it make if, after charged with murder, he was executed because he didn't weep at his mother's funeral, since it all came to the same thing in the end? So what's the sort of realization there? Nothing matters, right? I mean, you want to kill yourself? Kill yourself. If you don't want to kill yourself, great. Decide tomorrow whether you're going to do it, because it doesn't make any difference at all. Not just your own death, but the death of others. Now look at the next passage from The Rebel. Here he's engaging in some retrospective. And this is from the very beginning of the work. He says, our purpose is to find out whether innocence, the moment it becomes involved in action, can avoid committing murder. This is a really pressing question for not only his time, but our own time. By participating in a society, are we involving ourselves in injustice, in cruelty, in murder? I'll come back to this in a moment, because I'll tell you one way in which this comes up for me quite often in like teaching ethics classes and some of the circles I move in, which are food related. If you think about factory farming, it's pretty horrific. It's a recent development too. It's not like people weren't abusing animals, 40 years ago, but they weren't abusing them in a mechanical way that had so much cruelty as we see now today. And if you want to buy, meat or milk or eggs that isn't factory farmed, it costs quite a bit more. So one of the things that one could do is become a vegan. But even that isn't completely cruelty-free, because all that farming If you start thinking about animal suffering, those mice who are ground to a pulp under the tines of the machines, pulling up the fields, and suffer a moment of terror before they're torn to shreds, or poisoned, by pesticides, so that we can grow the things. There's no way you can eat without being involved in some sort of suffering or cruelty. And so you could say, well, I can minimize it. Very tough to do. Very tough to even know that you're doing it. Because you can buy stuff from this, this thing that's got an ethical stamp of approval and find out that they lied. And now, are you responsible for that? And we face these sorts of problems. And Camus was very conscious of this, not only in terms of, say, animal life, but human life. So he says, we can act only in terms of our own time among the people who surround us. We shall know nothing until we know whether we have the right to kill our fellow men, or the right to let them be killed. In that every action today leads to murder, direct or indirect, we cannot act until we know whether or why we have the right to kill. So the important thing is not as yet to go to the root of things, but the world being what it is, to know how to live in it. He says, in the age of negation, so he's talking about the past, it was of some avail to examine one's position concerning suicide. In the age of ideologies, in the new age after World War II, we must examine our position in relation to murder. If murder has rational foundations, then our period and we ourselves are rationally consequent. If it has no rational foundations, we are insane, and there is no alternative but to find some justification or to avert our faces. It's incumbent upon us to give a definite answer to the question implicit in the blood and strife of this century. For we are being put to the rack. 30 years ago, before reaching a decision to kill, people denied many things, to the point of denying themselves by suicide. God is deceitful. The whole world, myself included, is deceitful. Therefore, I choose to die. Suicide was the problem then. Ideology today is concerned only with the denial of other human beings, who alone bear the responsibility of deceit. It's then we kill. So he says, this essay proposes in the face of murder and rebellion to pursue a train of thought which began with suicide and the idea of the absurd, but for the moment this train of thought yields only one concept, that of the absurd. And the concept of the absurd leads only to a contradiction as far as the problem of murder is concerned. Awareness of the absurd, when we lay claim to deduce a rule of behavior from it, makes murder seem a matter of indifference, to say the least, and hence possible. And a little bit later on in it, he says, in our daily trials, rebellion plays the same role as the cogito, the Cartesian cogito, so important for the French philosophers. I think, therefore I am, a sort of self-assertion. He says, rebellion plays the same role as the cogito in the realm of thought. It is the first piece of evidence, but this evidence lures the individual from its solitude. It founds its first value on the whole human race. I rebel, therefore we exist. So it asserts a beginning of solidarity. It doesn't automatically make us all brothers or something like that. But he talks, and that's part of what the Rebel is about, analyzing different forms of rebellion, different ways in which people deal with an absurd world. And how they can, is that up here? That's how they can function within its scope, right? So rebellion offers a possibility for introducing something new, a kind of value into the world that the absurd is always, in the end, going to have the last word on. It's always going to win. But for a while, you can have something more. It could be love, it could be the class struggle, it could be solidarity, it could be alleviating suffering, it could be all sorts of different things. And he thinks that we have to engage in this. So that's what he's doing in his works. He's engaging in acts of, as he would say, revolting or rebelling or standing up for something, even knowing that he's sooner or later going to get knocked down again. And he examines a number of different ways in which somebody might do that, but really end up giving into an ideology. So his talk with his Nazi friend is a great example of that. Actually, I'll read a little bit more from one of the other letters to a German friend. Well, actually, this is from the first one. He says, this is about the French. We had much to overcome. First of all, the constant temptation to emulate you. For there's always something in us that yields to instinct, to contempt for intelligence, to the cult of efficiency. Our great virtues eventually become tiresome to us. We become ashamed of our intelligence, and sometimes we imagine some barbarous state where truth would be effortless. But the cure for this is easy. You're there to show us what such imagining would lead to. If I believed in some fatalism in history, I would suppose you're placed beside us, helots of the intelligence as our living reproof. And he ends up talking about overcoming another thing. He says, we had to overcome our weakness for mankind, the image we'd formed of a peaceful destiny, that deep-rooted conviction of ours that no victory ever pays, whereas any mutilation of mankind is irrevocable. We had to give up our knowledge and our hope, the reasons we had for loving, and the loathing we had for war. Now we've done all that. We had to make a long detour, and we're far behind. It's a detour that regard for truth imposes on intelligence, that regard for friendship imposes on the heart. It's a detour that safeguarded justice and put truth on the side of those who question themselves. And he says, we paid dearly for this. We paid with humiliations and silences, with bitter experiences, with prison sentences, with executions at dawn, desertions and separations, daily pangs of hunger, emaciated children, and above all with humiliation of our human dignity. And so he's saying we paid a pretty horrific price for actually thinking that values mattered, and that we wouldn't just give in and be like all the other bastards out there doing whatever to try to succeed, like the Nazis, for example. And I think there's something to that. Now, it could have been that the Nazis could have won and the French could have been totally wiped out, exploited into the very ground, and ultimately, destroyed as a nation, as the people who they were, conscripted into all sorts of, conditions that would have brutalized them individually and eventually destroyed them. That didn't happen. That was a possibility of history, just like so many places that did happen, right? But by being willing to stick with things that seem antiquated, like truth or justice, and allow them to impose demands on us, even though we realize, this is what Camus would say, even though we realize that it's really us choosing to allow them to impose demands on us, we keep ourselves human in a way that the others didn't. The Nazis didn't. The Soviets didn't. The people who were given to revolutionary violence in Algeria and saw no problem with killing civilians didn't. And that's really, I think, what his works are about, trying to understand and preserve. So I think he's a particularly timely person for us to read in this era of hyper-partisanship and thinking that somehow one side could set everything right, Because I'll conclude with this. The one thing that I do like about him is he's not just saying, well, both sides are bad, so I'm just going to step back and not be involved with anybody. I'll just, as Voltaire said, we have to cultivate our garden, so I've got my little place here and everybody else stays out of it. No, he was willing to, jump in and take the, getting pounded down by his own side to stand up and say, this is right, this is wrong. And so what we have here is somebody who believes the world is absurd, doesn't have an inherent meaning, and yet thinks there are important values that have to be stood up for, and is trying to diagnose how we do that. Maybe not completely successfully, and maybe not everything that he says can be transposed directly onto our own time. But I think he offers us a very interesting way to look at the history of our time. So, do you guys have any questions or?
I have one.
Yeah.
Like you, I think it's a with all the existentialists and so forth.
Yeah.
I don't hear anything about that anymore. There's still people writing, still being discussed, or is that something that's passed on in your
Well, it's interesting because there are still a very few Neoplatonists out there. Today is there's total digression. Today, November 7th, is the day that in the Renaissance, the Neoplatonists said, that's Plato's birthday. Sort of like people said, Jesus was born on December 25th, right? Nobody knows. But they decided to celebrate it. And there are still a few people out there like doing Neoplatonic exercises who...
Take it all back. Okay,
No. I mean, they're
What
definitely not a...
the role of
Yeah.
other existentialist philosophy professors are books still being written?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, there's a couple books recently, Existentialism and Romantic Love by Skye Cleary. There's an Existentialist Survival Guide that I haven't read, and I don't remember who that's by, but it's on my shelf to review. So there are people still interested in it, and there are people still quite interested in some of the key figures. Like there's a book out called Surfing with Sartre, that came out in the last couple of years, drawing on those two things. There's still a big interest in, I'd say, Nietzsche and Kierkegaard and Dostoevsky, maybe less in Camus as such, and I think the interest in him tends to focus mostly on the early stuff, not the later stuff, because the early stuff lets you, be angsty, and so this leads into another thing. Do people get into the existentialists? Yes, adolescents do, because they're all alienated and they have to, have something that explains why the world sucks, and so the existentialists are there to provide that. So if you teach a class in college on existentialism, it'll fill up.
They buy right into it, yeah.
Now that's the existentialism as read by like 18-year-olds, right? And it's really interesting. I bought into that, right? And when I was in college, I was, reading Camus and Sartre and Nietzsche, and I read Kierkegaard. I was like, he's too religious for me. I don't really get this God stuff. And I got certain themes out of it that were helpful for me for thinking about, like, okay, what choices am I making, and are these really my own responsibility? And I think that can be quite helpful for a person to take responsibility. Now, you could get that through CBT, you could get that through studying Stoicism. There's other ways to realize that you have actually made part of the situation you're in and made the person who you are. But then when you start reading these existentialists later on, you start reading them in your 30s and 40s, you start seeing lots of other things in their works, because they were older when they were writing this, that you missed the first time around. And, for example, this book, when I was in college, I read it, and I thought, the sign that Camus, his early stuff was great, that I can figure out. This stuff, I don't know what the hell he's talking about, I read it as a person in my 40s, and I'm like, wow, this is pretty deep. There's amazing stuff here. Because I think, we do go through life stages, and there may be ways to sort of speed it up for some people. And some people actually just remain immature their whole life too, right? But I think most of us go through a normal kind of progression where we get different things out of these, just as we might out of like listening to music, right? You're listening to music as a young person. Unless you're really, really talented, you're probably just hearing part of what's going on. You listen to the same music when you're older and can pay more attention to it, you hear other things. So I think the existentialists, there is interest in them. They can be useful for us. I don't want to say that they're providing us with something that we can't get somewhere else. But, they're putting things together in interesting ways. And there isn't like one single thing out there that's existentialism. There's Camus, who's doing one thing. There's Sartre, who's doing a related thing but different in other ways. There's de Beauvoir, who's doing other things. Marcel, and we could go sort of down the list, and you could say, well, what do they all have in common? You can put them together in kind of a composite picture, but they're almost all outliers from that composite picture. Sartre was the guy who was super successful in sort of taking over the movement and defining what he meant by it and pushing everybody else out. But I don't see any reason why we should accept his doing that, Yeah. And what do you think? I mean, you've read some of these figures. Do you think they're useful for people today, or?
you said adolescent angst. It's
Yeah.
I thought, well, yeah, that's right. That's why I
Throws
read
you
it.
right back
Yeah,
there, doesn't
Yeah.
it?
exactly. And it spoke to me very meaningfully.
Yeah,
It
And I read it
does.
for years, and then I got depressed. And I thought that's because they have no answer.
yeah.
It's just wallowing. God.
Yeah.
oh my God.
I mean, you could remember The Catcher in the Rye. Everybody's a phony, right? So that's an existentialist novel in a way, but it's totally useless because, first of all, not everybody is a phony. Sooner or later, you got to realize like there is a difference between the people who are just putting on airs and the people who you actually like do need to go all in with. But even if everybody else was a phony, what the hell good does that do? Pointing it all out. You know?
When I got married and started having a child, I needed some answers.
Yeah.
Some meaning.
Yeah, and with Camus, you know, I think that's part of what's going on. And you know, maybe to go back to the history thing, the fact that the history he's in just was so much just conflict and you know, people willing to gut each other over, you know, the smallest differences in ideas. Maybe that's speeding up the process of thinking these things through for him in a way that doesn't happen for us because we're a bit more insulated, you know.
So would you say his answer to this nothingness is to stand up for something, to
Yeah.
believe in something, whatever your cause is?
Yeah, but you have to be careful about what you pick, right?
Yeah.
Because I mean, you could like say, oh, I'm going to stand up for something cool. I'm going to go join whatever our equivalent of the Nazis
Right.
or the Bolsheviks
He has to
are.
contain justice.
Yeah, and it has to, you could say it has to continue to contain justice over time, because it's really easy to like be just at this point in time. This is how people join movements, right?
Yeah.
These are the good guys, and then the good guys start cutting corners and making deals, and then suddenly they've turned into what it was that they were opposing, right? And at that point in time, you'd have to like say, well, you guys are,
Yeah.
you know, you guys are
The
bad.
wrong way.
And if you do that, they'll kick you out of the party, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So, or shut you up in some way.
Put
or-
you in prison.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. And I think he'd say you have to be willing to go to face that.
Yeah.
So it means that the people who are genuinely committed to doing the right thing are probably not going to be super successful,
No.
unfortunately. You know, I mean, think about our own like party system. This is something I've been thinking about for quite a while. It is possible to do good stuff in local politics, you know. But once you start catching the eyes of the movers and shakers, and they start having you meet people, and you start having to think about how are you going to fund your next campaign, you start to rise through the ranks, and you inevitably become corrupted. And I think in some places more. Like, I think Wisconsin is probably better than Illinois. I think it's like impossible to rise above even the most local level in Illinois without becoming corrupt.
I was really discouraged, though, reading that our senators in Washington have a building across the street where they spend all their time, because you're not allowed to call for fundraising in
Oh.
the building. So they do their vote, and then they go over
And ask-
literally spend all day, every day fundraising.
Wow.
Isn't that sad?
Yeah, I mean, we've reached the point where we've sort of boxed ourselves into a corner with how things are done. And anybody who wants to like fix the system from within, they've got to go through that like formation process, and by the time they reach the top, they've been corrupted by it.
Exactly.
You know?
It's the only way they can keep their job.
Yeah.
They like the power, and they're willing to do anything.
I mean, I think something similar happens with corporations too. People are, I'm gonna join this, and when I get in, I'm gonna make things different. And it's, yeah, and you can sometimes, and every once in a while you'll get like one person who's been waiting until they're about to retire before they finally stick it to the system,
Yeah,
right?
that's good.
But usually by that time somebody else sees it coming and they're able to deflect it, you know. So yeah, it's too bad, but it is the human condition, you know. So then the question is, well, what do we do? It's we could say, oh, it's all crap then. Well, you still can get involved in local politics, and provided you don't succumb to the desire to have everybody like you and shape you so that you can, someday be a senator, you could actually get a lot done in local politics. It's sort of, we've talked about this, the Peter Principle. Do you guys remember that book, the Peter? Everyone rises to their level of incompetence.
Right.
And one of the suggestions that the guy who wrote it, Peter, I forget what was his. It was something Peters, right? Was his name? He talked about creative incompetence, which is rather than allowing yourself to get promoted from level to level, you start like screwing up in some way at the level where
At
you're
that
happy.
level, right.
Yeah. So
Okay.
like maybe if you're a politician, you have weird quirks, like you won't take corporate money at this point, and then they're not going to boost you up.
No, they're just sitting there.
Yeah. Or I don't know, you could talk about something in a way that alienates some voters or some donors, Yeah. Any other questions or comments or?
Well, thank you very much.
Well, yeah, thanks for being here, and we're going to do this again next year. In the spring, we do somebody from ancient philosophy, and I've picked Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher who started out as a slave. In the summer, we do medieval philosophy, so we're going to do St. Thomas Aquinas, and who I think is long overdue in the series. We've done Augustine, Boethius, and Anselm so far. And then in the modern, in the fall, we do the modern period. So we do, this time it's going to be Jean-Jacques Rousseau. We've done Locke and Hobbes and Descartes. And then in the winter, and I'm calling this winter, even though we're not officially in winter yet. Yeah. That's when we do like the 20th century philosophy people. So I'm going to do Simone de Beauvoir for that one. So we've got a good year ahead, and this is the third year of this series. So.
It's the first